My formal first and last name is Leopold Solomon, as middle name Ullman, Ullman.
And should we call you Leo?
Please, anything other than
Then
Leopold.
I told you I knew that during the war, other Jews were hidden besides the Frank family, but the story of Anne Frank was what I grew up knowing. Tell me some of your story, because I was amazed to learn some similarity in the sense of what you went through. Tell me about your history in going back to the war.
Well, my history really starts with my parents. My mother was part of a quite wealthy family, well-to-do in the diamond cutting business, which was very important in Amsterdam, and very much controlled by Jewish persons in Amsterdam. My father was German, came to Holland when he finished high school, got a job at the largest department store, the Bijenkorf Beehive in Amsterdam.
Okay.
And he and my mother married in 1936, and in 1939 I was born. We had a comfortable life, lived in an apartment in Amsterdam South, which is where most of the reasonably well-to-do Jewish families lived, and life was fine. In May of 1940, Hitler attacked the city of Rotterdam, even though he had promised as late as September 1939 that he would not open a front on the western part of Europe and involve Holland, because Holland had been neutral in World War I. So everybody in Holland was sort of comfortable that maybe they would be exempted from whatever Hitler might do in Western Europe. At any rate, as from that day in May of 1940, life became very difficult. My parents and I and a grandmother on my mother's side decided to try to escape the first days of the war. We went to a fishing port where the rumors were that you could get a fishing boat to go to England, and from England you could get to America, to the US or Canada. Several members of my family and their families were able to get out during those first couple of days. We went to one of the fishing ports. It was utter chaos. There weren't many boats available. There wasn't one big boat available. So we went back to our apartment, and the idea was we'd escape another day.
And you were at this point, you're not even 2? How old are you?
I was born in July of 1939, so
Okay.
I was not yet 2.
Yeah, not yet 2 years old.
At that point, we went back to the apartment, and we were not able to get out because the Germans sealed the border quickly. But we lived in Amsterdam. We were comfortable. Suddenly, a new governor was appointed to run the Netherlands, what is now the Netherlands. And it was Seyss-Inquart, who had been the governor of Austria, a roaring anti-Semite, determined to segregate the Jews immediately. And so we started being subject to decrees which were increasingly severe. We first had to have all Jews move to Amsterdam. Then we had to wear the Jewish star for anybody over 6 years old. And they had to be sewn on our clothes so they weren't temporary. We had to give a list of everything we owned that was of any value, including up to gold teeth. And we weren't allowed to have telephones. We weren't allowed to have any mode of transport, no bikes, no cars, weren't allowed to use public transportation, the trams or buses.
Right.
No trains. We couldn't have a telephone, we couldn't have a radio. And on and on. We couldn't use public schools. We couldn't go to restaurants. We couldn't use public parks. But we were alive.
At what point, from what your parents later told you, did they decide that they were going to hide themselves and have you raised by another family to keep you alive?
They made the decision when my father received a call-up notice the same day as Margot Frank to report to ultimately a transport and a train station and to go to work camps, as they called them in Germany.
And these were what we know are the concentration camps.
They are, but they were not yet killing camps. And my parents thought that they were young and healthy, that they could survive. And my father went to the train station to see what was happening. And he saw that it was not just healthy people going to work camps. It was invalids, it was babies, it was youngsters, it was the elderly. And they were being pushed into cattle cars that were sealed. And then they made that decision that with all the vicious decrees, with the strike that had occurred, the only strike in Europe where the dock workers struck against the German government because of the brutality against the Jews. And 450 Jews were picked up. No, I'm sorry, 450 young persons were picked up, mostly from that dock workers strike union, and of those, only one person survived.
So your father decided at that point?
They decided at that point that the only way that they could survive would be to go into hiding, to go, as we call it, to the underground, to the burial underground, in effect. Onderduikers, we call it in Dutch, diving unders. So from being fully assimilated, they suddenly had to live, as my mother called it, to live like rats. It was a very difficult decision because they couldn't take me into hiding with them. They had found an apartment, I'm sorry, an attic on a main street in Amsterdam, the Centuurbaan, which is called the Beltway. And there they had a hiding place for themselves.
Someone would help them who was
Well,
not Jewish?
Yes, but they paid for it.
Yeah.
They rented this hiding place. It was in effect on the third floor, and on the ground floor was a shoe store. At the same time, they had to figure out what to do with me. And through my mother's sorority, she had been at the university for 1 year. Through her sorority, Arctos, they were put in touch with the minister in Harlem who placed Jewish kids in hiding. And through that minister, I was placed with a young man and his wife who lived in a suburb of Amsterdam. And I was there briefly, and then I was shipped off to a sort of orphanage north of Amsterdam because their marriage broke up, probably because of me. But their parents, I guess, sort of liked me, and their father was a retired policeman. And he was able, through his police connections, to get a permit to go through the German lines at the train station and to go to North Amsterdam on his bike and pick me up at this facility. They brought me back to their apartment, and that's where I stayed for 2.5 years.
So a man who was not your biological grandfather
No, he wasn't.
went and found you so that he could
He
keep
did
you
not
safe.
know who I was on purpose. Only the resistance knew where I was and knew where my parents were. My parents didn't know where I was, nor whether I was alive.
In talking to the people that were your war parents later on, why did they do this?
I asked my war mother that all the time, even at her deathbed. She died in the early 80s. Even at her deathbed, I asked, why would you do that? And she said, because it's the right thing to do. She was religious. They were Dutch Reformed. They said it was the right thing to do. I would add a caveat to that, which is that nobody knew how long this war would last.
Right.
It lasted 5 years. People had no idea it would be that long.
Were you, because you were so young, were you aware that the people that I'm assuming you were calling mom and dad or some version of that,
Opa and Oma.
Opa and Oma, were you aware that they weren't?
I was not.
Yeah.
I was a youngster. I mean, I was 1.5 years when the war started and 3.5 when I went into hiding. And I came to think that these were my parents
Yeah. So when the
because I had nothing to reinforce my separation from my real parents.
so when the war ended, how did you then get reunited with your parents?
Through the resistance, they came to learn where I was, and my war parents knew that if my parents survived, they would come to pick me up. And sure enough, the doorbell rang at a given moment, and these two people showed up. I did not remember them. My real parents looked awful. My father's feet had grown to enormous size because he hadn't walked. My mother and father were perhaps 75 pounds because they were subject to abject starvation toward the end of the war. And they said they were my parents, and I didn't know them. I went with them to where they were in hiding, and then was brought back to the apartment with Oma and Opa. And over a period of days, perhaps weeks, we transitioned, and I came to live with my real parents.
I guess your childhood in that time during the war, do you have any memories of it?
I honestly do not,
Yeah.
and there was no way to reinforce my period in hiding because I didn't live with the people who took care of me after the war, and my parents didn't know, what was happening to me,
Right.
and we didn't take pictures in those days. So
And you were in hiding, but you were living out in the world. Is that correct? Like, were you were like their child in that space?
I was. They tried to pass me off as a grandchild.
Okay.
They dyed my hair blonde, and I was not out of the apartment after the first week or two.
Oh, wow.
So I really stayed in that entire time, and we ate sugar beets and tulip bulbs, which I thought was normal fare, and we survived somehow.
Your parents, as you talk about, survived somehow too. What did they tell you? What did you learn in the years later about what that hiding was like for them?
Well, they were in basically a single room with no light or electricity, no toilet facility, just a horrible situation. One window, with each other for 24 hours a day. I don't know how you do that. I mean, well, at any rate, So they did not know what happened to me, but they had a very difficult time. I did not knowingly suffer during the war, in part because my war father had a girlfriend who was German and worked at a bar in Holland. So they would come to know when there would be a raid, and that probably helped save my life. So they would ship me to the country where their son lived, and they would bring me back when the raids were over.
This entire exhibit tells, obviously, the Frank family's story, but also so much about the war. And there were stories like yours that are parallel stories. What do you think when you walk in to an exhibit like this?
Well, of course, I have been very much involved with the Anne Frank story over the years, and been to the Anne Frank house many times. I am just wowed by the exhibit. It is so phenomenal. And the importance of it is it's an educational spot that is just phenomenal for everybody of young age in America. Education is the critical part about learning of the Holocaust, and the story of Anne Frank is sort of the face of the Holocaust. But my perception of it is I am so focused on the fact that Anne Frank was not Dutch. The story is that it's Dutch, of course, but she was German.
She was German.
And the others in the factory and in the office at the factory were also German. So 8 people trying to hide in the back house, it's such a different story. They were doomed in my mind. And the idea of trying to feed those 8 people and take care of them, all that Miep and others had to go through to arrange that, it's so different from the story of Dutch people who were hidden and had some support, like my mother did with the sorority that was the intermediary.
But in some ways, to me, and seeing it from the outside, there's the similar thing, the thing that ties them, is that there was somebody who was willing to help, to do the right thing. You talk about your war mother. Why do it? Because it was the right thing. There were people that didn't do the right thing.
That's absolutely true. And there were people who were taken in by caretakers during the war who were not treated well. And there were people who were forced to adopt a religion other than their own, which my war parents did not force upon me. No, I think it's a different story for Anne Frank, because they didn't have the support that the Dutch people in hiding often had with other Dutch people who were righteous Gentiles also.
Right. The sharing your story, sharing this story, why is it so important for that to happen?
Well, I think it's so important to tell the story because you hear the name Holocaust very often, and you see the pictures of Anne Frank as the face of the Holocaust. But the most important part of the story, in my mind, is the fact that this was forced upon the population by the government. There was always anti-Semitism in Holland, in Germany, in Europe, in the Middle East. There was also always anti-Semitism. But the fact that this came from the government and started at the beginning of life in Germany once Hitler took over, that's the part of the Holocaust story that, to me, is so different from where you see protests and killings and even quasi-genocide in other countries. just the way it happened in Germany is so different from what we are seeing here and there in the world. And I think, therefore, it's so important to keep the story of Anne Frank alive because it involved 6 million people and 1.5 million Jewish kids. That was a government orchestrated happening.
Is there a part of this exhibit, or even the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam, because obviously this has a recreation, but is there a part of this exhibit that for you speaks the loudest?
Well, yes, but it's because of personal relationships.
Yeah.
I became very close for a while with Miep Gies, whose grandchildren were here last night. And I was the head of the Anne Frank Center USA for many years and a member of the board for 20 years. And through that, I spent quite a lot of time with Miep. So that's the part that resonates with me, the role of Miep in saving the diary.
And it really, this doesn't exist if she hadn't found that day. And you wonder, what would we have potentially like this?
Well, I think the importance of the diary we saw at the program last night, when Ronald Leopold, the head of the Anne Frank House in Holland, and a critical resource for creating this fantastic venue, they focused quite a bit, I think, on the Miep story and so forth. So
again, it's one of the people that had to do the right thing.
Well, what Ronald did last night, which was so interesting, is that he focused on another child who was born the same day, a young boy, born the same day, and there is no history of that person. They don't know what happened to him. They have no documents, no records, and yet it was a boy who was at the same school, who was Jewish, lived near Anne Frank, and that's what would have happened if Miep hadn't saved the diary, I fear.
Having an exhibit like this here in New York City, sort of another why is it so important? People can go to the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam, but to have an exhibit like this that isn't there, that opens it up to others, why does that matter?
Oh, it is fantastic, because to get into the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam, apart from having to go to Holland, which in the winter is no fun there either, but quite apart from having to go there, it's very difficult to get into the Anne Frank house. It's very popular.
Right.
I think they had 1.2 million visitors last year. So there are many Americans introduced to the Anne Frank story, and that's sort of it. Yeah. This creates something tangible that they can see, that shows her life, her history, her family, what it was like to be in hiding, her boyfriend, even her becoming a woman and her feelings toward her parents. Mm-hmm. That's all in the diary, and this exhibit brings that to people. The reach of this exhibit will be fantastic. I know so many schools in New Jersey, where I've been active, and on Long Island, who will be coming to this exhibit. And it will be their first introduction to the Anne Frank story in a manner that's understandable and a story that's acceptable, rather than reading about it in a book and so forth.
These generations, they take it in differently,
Right.
and this really brings
It's
you
visual.
into it. Yeah, it's visual, and it puts you in that space, and
Yes.
it grabs your. It's hard not to pay attention, I would say. In touring, in walking through with Ronald, he kept pointing out, and this was so important, different things that were about hope. in that space that kept the families going while they were there. Peter bringing his bicycle in. He wasn't going to be able to ride it, but there was hope for the future. In talking to your parents, were you that hope for them that one day they get out? Did they ever talk to you about what kept them going through such horrible conditions despite getting help?
My parents didn't talk about it very much at all until their 50th wedding anniversary. And at that point, my mother wrote her story through an adult education class in Port Washington. And that story, which she called a story of survival, she wrote it out by hand and gave it to my brother and me. My brother, my wife figured out, was born 9 months after the end of the war, so we sort of know how my parents may have celebrated the end of the war. At any rate, they gave that book to us, their story of survival, and from that point on, they had no problem talking about it. It was cathartic to write this story up. And they talked at many schools, and we came to learn a lot. And what was interesting to me, I ultimately wrote a book about our story. And in preparing that book, I was able to get a huge number of documents which somehow had been saved during the war, and that's so unusual. And I never got to ask my parents how they did that. I suspect it was they gave it to a sorority sister, but I really don't know. Yeah. But for my parents, once that book was done, they had no problem talking to schools, and they did it often.
So what kept them going? What kept them going while they were in hiding?
They purposely didn't talk about me. They made a vow to each other not to talk about me because it would be too difficult. And what kept them going was the same as Anne Frank, hope. Somehow hope that this would all end. And there was, through the resistance at least, contact with the outside where they could learn that their parents in turn were taken care of. Which happened through another policeman in the city of Utrecht.
Leo, is there anything else that you'd want to say about the exhibit, about your story, anything along those lines?
The only thing I'd like to say is that it is just an unbelievable effort to have created this marvelous exhibit in a period we heard last night of 10 months.
10 months, I know.
And this exhibit is phenomenal, and it's wonderful. And I'm just so happy that my wife and I were able to help support it.
Thank you.